Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the really fascinating science behind a phenomenon that plagues almost all of us. And yeah, that absolutely includes me when I miss an incredibly easy shot right in front of my friends. We're looking at why checking your mechanics under pressure is literally the exact move that dismantles a well-learned skill. Now, you might think that when the stakes rise, the responsible thing to do is to lock in, review your technique. But it turns out the research points in the exact opposite direction.
All right, let's jump right into section 1, the problem with pressure, and look at exactly what happens to our bodies when the stakes get high. So, picture this. You're in the middle of doing something you could normally do in your sleep. It's like a musician's fingers suddenly stalling mid-phrase, a lifter re-gripping the bar 3 times, or a golfer completely frozen over a short, simple putt. Have you ever felt the stakes rise, decided the responsible move was to really double-check your technique, and then watch the whole thing just completely fall apart in your hands? You slowed down, you thought it through, you made absolutely sure of your grip, your setup, your first move, and yet the result comes out stiff, late, and just wrong in a way it never, ever does in practice.
Well, our instinct when the pressure climbs is to take manual control, mostly because it feels like diligence, right? But here is the real kicker. A well-learned skill does not live in the part of your mind that can actually describe it. You built that skill by repetition until it ran completely automatically, no narration needed. The moment you start narrating again, you're basically asking a system that no longer needs supervision to accept a supervisor who doesn't even know how to do the job anymore. The checking isn't neutral. The checking actually is the interference.
So what does this all mean? To solve this incredibly frustrating cycle, we really have to look at the science. And it turns out there are 2 competing scientific explanations for choking. They get merged together constantly, but telling them apart completely changes what you should actually do about it. So let's unpack these 2 distinct failures.
Which brings us to section 2, 2 ways skills fail. This is also known as state versus trait, and understanding this distinction is the absolute key to protecting your performance.
On one hand, we have explicit monitoring. This is an account associated with researchers Sion Belock and Thomas Carr. Think of it like suddenly staring at your own feet while trying to walk normally. Pressure raises your self-consciousness, and that turns your attention inward onto step-by-step execution. Attending to a highly proceduralized skill actually degrades it. It's what we call a state problem, meaning it's all about where your attention is right in this present moment. On the flip side, we have reinvestment theory. This is a trait problem. It's all about the heavy backpack of explicit rules you're carrying with you into the game.
I actually found this foundational piece of research absolutely fascinating. Way back in 1992, Rich Masters proved that the way you learn a skill dictates exactly how it survives under pressure. So he taught people to putt a golf ball in 2 different ways. The explicit learners worked from written instructions, so they formed conscious rules. But the implicit learners, they practiced while a demanding secondary task occupied their mind, which meant they built the skill without much verbal knowledge of how they were actually doing it. And guess what? When pressure was applied, the explicit learners deteriorated, while the implicit learners held up perfectly.
Okay, moving on to section 3, the evidence in action. Let's see how researchers are actually testing these theories in the real world.
Just look at this incredibly cool 2008 study by Kristen Flegel and Michael Anderson. They took 80 participants who had golfing experience and had them learn a novel putting task until they hit 3 successful putts in a row. Then, they split the group right down the middle. Half spent 5 minutes describing their putting technique in detail. The other half just did a totally unrelated verbal task. After that, everyone putted again. And this brilliantly illustrates the danger of overthinking. The more skilled golfers who spent those 5 minutes simply explaining their own technique needed roughly twice as many putts to get back to the exact standard they had just reached. Twice as many. Meanwhile, the less skilled golfers were barely affected at all. It just goes to show how fragile verbal knowledge makes a highly developed skill.
And that right there is the core mechanism of reinvestment theory, which was developed by Masters and John Maxwell. Under pressure, we basically reinvest explicit knowledge into a movement that has long since stopped needing it. We're forcing conscious rules into an automatic movement. And crucially, some people are way more prone to this than others, treating this tendency as a measurable disposition rather than just the universal reaction that happens to everybody.
You can actually see this beautifully in field data too. In a 2006 field hockey study by Jackson and colleagues, players were asked to dribble a slalom course. The players who were told to pay attention to their own skill execution, they slowed down by almost half a second, 0.44 seconds to be exact. But notice the distraction group.
Players who were given a secondary distracting task actually sped up by 1/4 of a second. Distraction literally improved their physical performance because it kept their conscious mind completely out of the way.
But hey, before we totally overhaul your entire training regimen based on this, we definitely need to pause. Before you take any of this as settled fact, remember that almost all of this data comes from laboratories. And in that field study, the damage really landed on one particular kind of person.
And that leads us to Section 4, the honest caveat, where we talk about the limits of this science.
Because if we look really closely at what these studies actually were, Flegel and Anderson used undergraduates on indoor greens, meaning decent amateurs, for sure, but definitely not touring pros. And Masters' implicit learning method? It's an elegant lab trick, absolutely, but try keeping that up for a full athletic season. Furthermore, in the hockey study, the pressure-related collapse was heavily concentrated in players who naturally score high as reinvestors. They slowed down significantly more than low reinvestors. Because explicit monitoring and reinvestment predict overlapping outcomes, telling them apart from the outside is actually genuinely hard to do.
So, let's move from theory into practice with Section 5, your action plan. We're going to cover 3 crucial moves to prevent you from choking. We can build a really strong defense against choking by following a super clear 3-step action plan derived directly from the research we've just been exploring. So, let's break down each of these 3 steps so you can start implementing them right away.
Step 1. Audit your rule count. Seriously, sit down and write down every single verbal instruction you carry for your key skill. You need to recognize that if a skill is already grooved and well learned, adding a 12th conscious rule isn't diligence, it's ammunition. It is explicit knowledge, just waiting to be reinvested and misfire the second the stakes rise. You've got to keep your conscious rules to an absolute minimum.
Step 2, borrow the implicit route wherever you can. When you're rehearsing a well-learned skill, give your conscious system a job that is absolutely not supervision. Hum a tempo, count a cadence, or just hold a light conversation. That is exactly what the dual task condition was doing in that hockey study we looked at. And remember, those players actually got faster, not slower. You want to occupy the mind so the body can do its work.
And finally, Step 3. Find out if you're actually one of the vulnerable ones. Look back at your last 3 bad performances. If your head was completely full of step-by-step mechanics each time, you are actively reinvesting. That means your fix lives in how you prepare, not in how hard you try on the actual day of the performance.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, absolutely crucial question to ask yourself the very next time the pressure climbs and things start to go sideways. When you fall apart, is your head full of technique or full of worry? Because honestly, knowing the difference might just be the key to unlocking your absolute best performance when it matters most. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I really hope this helps you keep your mechanics on autopilot right where they belong,